We're now going to start diving into the different phyla of animals. When we talk about the organization of things, it goes kingdom, phylum, order, class, genus, species, so on and so forth. It's not the exact order, but just understand that taxonomists have named these creatures based on similarities that they have. It's not perfect. It'd be very, very tough to put everything perfectly together. But we're going to start off with what we call the phylum Porifera. It gets its name porifera because it has a lot of pores, openings that allow it to eat and feed. They are our simplest type of animals. They do not have a very motile stage. They're not very mobile for very long. They do not have symmetry. They do not have true tissues. They kind of have a couple of different kinds of cells that work together. Obviously, if you don't have tissues, you can't have organs. They do reproduce sexually, and they do have the mobile stage of microscopic swimming larval stage. So we kind of equate this to basically a seed that can swim. And so when it does establish itself in an area that it likes, it will be able to produce more offspring and create a new sponge in these cases. So let's take a look at the body plan of a sponge. It has what's called the osculum, which is where the water will come in and out. There are pores within its body cavity where water will come in and then it goes out that osculum as mentioned. And so some sponges will actually be able to create their own currents where others will rely on the currents themselves. The texture of sponges is a lot like what we have in our kitchen. Some of them, however, are rigid or hard in structure from either the silicon in the sand or from calcium carbonate that might be in the ocean itself, but a lot of them are somewhat soft-bodied. They are able to generate currents with what we call these collar cells. A flagellum is able to move and kind of whip water around so that it's then able to, food is able to enter in this area where it then is absorbed using microvilli, little finger-like projections that bring it even closer to the cell, and there it's actually able to be consumed. You also have the amoeboid cells that are involved within the sponge, and that will also need to be fed. So all of these cells work together, but they're not necessarily true tissues. It's a lot of kind of individualization within the phyla porifera. And so when we look at examples of sponges, again, some of them look rigid, but they're actually somewhat soft. They just look rigid when they're full of water. And then some of them are indeed rigid in structure, and they come in a variety of different colors. Some of them have relationships with algae, and that's why they have different colorations on them. Here you're seeing a crystal lattice of one that does have some rigid or hard parts to it, and it's using the basically ingredients that are in the ocean to assemble that crystal lattice structure that you see in the slide. The next phylum is Cnidaria. The C is silent, and Cnidaria have two main body segments or body forms. The one that stays on the ground or stays on a rock or a sandy bottom is called a polyp, and the one that is more mobile is called a medusa. Certainly some very important words that we want to know. They're most notable for capturing their prey with what are kind of like tentacles. That's not the true term for them. Instead, they have what are called nematocysts. They are stinging projections. Some will be filled with poison, some will be somewhat electric. But regardless, they use those to sense their prey, and if they swim through, they're able to grab onto them, and then they're able to take it into their, basically their oral groove, or what would be like their stomach. So jellyfish are part of this, corals are part of this, anemone are part of this phylum. Here you're seeing a jellyfish and how it would use its tentacles to nab onto prey, and then bring it up to its oral groove or its stomach, and there it's able to be digested, but then also spit back out with things that aren't needed any longer. Some examples of the different diversity. So the jellyfish, sea anemones, coral, and then a big group of what are called hydra or hydrozoans. And here are the two main body parts that Cnidaria show. Key vocab words, by the way. Medusa is the free form. They don't necessarily use jet propulsion. Instead, they will take the water and then push it back out, not necessarily like in a stream, but somewhat using movement in order to get water out of its body cavity. And in a polyp, these are the ones that are anchored to some kind of like rock or sand or some bottom, and then it's able to sense out its prey by having these tentacles out here, and then it will take in through its oral groove or its stomach equivalent. Here, the stomach equivalent for the medusa. So two main body cavities of the Cnidaria. Here's an example of a hydra. So this is a polyp. It's established here on this little seagrass. A Daphnia comes and swims by. It grabs it on with these nematocysts. It will then bring it to its stomach, and now Daphnia is lunch. So that's how they're able to somewhat sense their environment. Anything that is not used by the hydra would then be spewed out through that same opening in the picture. There, like I said, a lot of jellyfish are part of this realm. They're able to use sometimes air as well as water in order to move throughout their habitat wherever they live. We then start to get into our worm phylum. Platyhelminthes are the simplest types of worms. These are the flatworms, and so these are going to be acoelomates, so they don't have a true body cavity. They're bilateral. They're cephalized, so we start to get a head end as well as some organ and organ systems. Most of these are also hermaphrodites, which means that they have both male and female parts. So reproduction is easier because they have ability to go through both processes. 3 classes of them that we see are Turbellaria, Trematoda, also known as the flukes, the Cestoda, also known as the tapeworms. Some of these are parasitic, some of them are not. And so when we look at the body cavity of the planaria, we start to see some of the digestive system. We're still not a mouth and anus here. We still have the same opening where food goes in as what comes out. But we see that these little parts are going to help spread the food and nutrition to all the different parts of the planaria. Another body system that starts to get some attention here is the nervous system. So here we don't have a true brain yet, but at least we have nerves and we have neurons that are able to send messages, help it move, help it kind of do its thing, navigate its life. We mentioned that a lot of these are hermaphrodites. So here you're seeing that they have ovaries, which would produce the eggs, as well as testes, which are going to produce the sperm. And then a genital pore. So we're not talking about a penis or vagina in this case. Instead, we're just talking about an opening where they can exchange the gametes. And then our last system that we see is the circulatory system here. And this would just be able to allow a little bit of, not necessarily blood, but in this case, water adjustments to control what's happening in the body. Here's an example of a parasitic one. So they have different stages and different life forms. And so what happens is sometimes this can be an undercooked meat that has been affected. And if it's not cooked properly, then sometimes it gets into the human, and a tapeworm inside the human is going to extract the nutrients that we take in. So parasites, remember, they're somewhat lazy. Once they're in something, they don't necessarily want to leave or leave unless they've had their fill of nutrients. So those are what we call our flatworms, Platyhelminthes. The next group are what we call our segmented worms, or phylum Annelid. These include things like our earthworms, our leeches, as we'll look at momentarily. And these worms have repeated segments, and then you also get some specialization within the segments. So let's take a look at some examples. So leeches can be parasitic, but also some are predatory. They have body segmentation, but you kind of have to have them in a certain light in order to see them. And they also have sharp jaws. So we definitely have that head end, mouth end thing going on. So here's a leech before feeding. Here it is after. And in this picture, you can actually see the different repeated segments, not as obvious as the earthworm. And you see that some of them are repeated, like they look a lot the same. But we also have some of the head end, that's where it's feeding, and then the tail end that takes place also. With earthworms, we really get a lot of segmentation that's even more obvious. Earthworms are kind of a unique creature. They got a lot of things going on, but segmentation is the one that we'll focus on. And here again, we get more specialization. We get more parts that sound like what humans have. So they actually have hearts. They got a lot of them, but they have hearts. They have like a mouth and a pharynx and an esophagus and a crop and a gizzard, like what we'd see in some reptiles and birds. Still not to the same level as some of our complex creatures, but still have complexity nonetheless. And we also get some of the systems and an actual brain in our earthworms. Here is that earthworm, and we see those segmentations very well with the camera flash. You see them really, really obviously up here, and how a lot of them are repeated, but also some specialization and cephalization within them. Here's an example of one that's a micrograph, but you see how earthworms are actually able to move, so they're not smooth. If you've ever kind of rubbed an earthworm the wrong way, they kind of feel almost like scratchy or rough, and these are little bristles that actually are helping them move in coordination in the soil. That's going to conclude this presentation where we talk about the first 4 phyla of the invertebrates. Thanks, and we'll talk to you soon.